lib protests, any arguments about complacency are bull. People who are engaged in social justice movements and generally care about these things have self-selected into engaging with more serious kind of protests as well. Secondly, this is a regrets motion, and I think that the comparative narrative that is likely to emerge is that there is a far higher bar to activism. So unless you are doing the real deal, like engaging in forms of visceral protest, you have no place in these movements whatsoever, which was historically what more of the narrative tended to look like. The final thing to say is that we agree with CO. This is about publicity in terms of sharing posts on social media, but it is also things like pride parades and the celebration of identity. The first claim that we want to forward is that there are tangible benefits of activism that is more performative in nature. The first reason for this is that sharing posts on social media are often done in ways that are tangible. So a lot of the time, there are often people within marginalized communities who start out by sharing the post, and then these become more popular and increasingly circulate on social media, meaning that the initial posts that are shared are often quite actionable in nature that directly clashes with the PM. So it's often signed X petition to get forms of change that if enough people share a post, it's going to raise money. It's often about sharing YouTube videos that can help people get visibility in more forms of funding. So even though the individual impact of sharing one post is diffused, when it's like bajillions of people around the world who are signing petitions and who are donating very small quantities of money, this can have a large cumulative impact. I mean, this is just a very clear impact in this debate and a tangible mechanism of how we were able to get more funding and get things like petitions being signed. The second tangible impact that also clashes with PM is that it's actively good to force politicians to take a stance on these issues. So there's been a lot of pressure for left-wing politicians to often share these kinds of posts, which they often do. So a lot of liberal politicians shared posts of Breonna Taylor. The reason this is really important is that once politicians on social media explicitly associate themselves with a certain progressive cause in the tangible evidence that they've shared these posts, this creates a lot more pressure for politicians to actually follow through with this and continue to couch a liberal messaging, or else it becomes a lot easier to point out this is actively contradictory. The second argument that we want to forward is that this has been a massively beneficial way to spread awareness about particular kinds of issues. So what this often looks like, as I already characterized, is the massive sharing of posts on social media, even if this is done in a semi-performative way where people don't care about these issues. We think and we can see that people in liberal circles are probably going to have a basic level of awareness under either side of a house, but there are social media echo chambers that are able to reach two groups of people who are previously alienated. So firstly, those who are slightly liberal-leaning in nature or centrist with left-leaning tendencies who are just not engaged in social justice. They don't have an aversion to activism, but they lack general forms of awareness and are not like very participatory in movements. But secondly, some people who are conservative, but who are not like mega conservative, and know that social media echo chambers often do extend in these directions. Even if most of your friends are liberal, you might have coworkers who are centrist or conservative in nature, or you just might have some friends who have different political ideologies than you do. So these are often people who are resistant to engage in traditional liberal-leaning media because of how politicized the media landscape is. So it's like the broad illusion that if you're reading the New York Times, you're actively consuming like centrist or liberal-based media. Whereas if your friends are sharing this stuff on social media, it doesn't matter if you're opposed to seeing this content because this forces you to grapple with it when you actively see it on your feed. So what this kind of activism has meant is that a lot of people who were previously not confronted with what the murder of African Americans in the United States looks like are literally forced to see these kind of issues on their feed. There's often like clicky things where you can read stories and get further information about these causes. This is important for a couple of reasons. So firstly, people who are centrist but have left-leaning tendencies are actually now more likely to take further action when they actually know that these causes exist. So I think that there are a lot of people who don't have like natural disinclinations to social justice, but just lack information under the status quo. And this particular stakeholder is more likely to actually further read about these issues. But secondly, there are just benefits of moderating how oppressive people are, even if they're not going to be actively engaged in forms of activism. So even if you were like slightly racist, just acknowledging that police brutality is actively an issue is still a good thing. The reason for this is that you might become slightly more introspective, so kind of do things like reflecting your own hiring practices slightly more, but also when we generally shift social ideology in the long term, it's more likely that right-wing parties are going to moderate the extremity of stances that you're taking on various issues. Before we get into the next argument about changing narratives surrounding activism, I'll take closing government.
Right-wing social movements that are anti-immigration, anti-abortion, etc. still exist and are probably more palatable to the majority. All of your analysis also reinforces things I suspect from your speech you would think are bad.
Okay, so I just think that the social normalization of like the alt-right is substantially lower than the social normalization of things like BLM to a wide extent. Like there's substantially more people are willing to affiliate with leftist movements under the status quo, especially as society becomes more progressive, meaning that we have a larger impact in that regard. Yeah, so that's what we'll respond to that. Okay, let's talk about how we've been able to change narratives surrounding what activism is. The first thing to say is that historically speaking, this has had a massive impact in the normalization of what we perceive social justice movements as being and in how inclined we are to engage in forms of activism. So the problem was historically that a lot of movements were perceived as being fringe, radical, and crazy in nature, and that if you are a feminist, you're weird and there's something that's wrong with you. And social ostracization becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where fewer individuals are actually willing to associate themselves with these kinds of movements. Now, when you have more people publicly coming out and wearing shirts that say things like "I'm a feminist," once again, even if that is performative in nature, I think that you broadly change ways that society perceives these kind of movements because we are social creatures, right? We often judge what is perceived as normal based on what our peers are perceived as normal. So what this means is that on an individual level, this kind of activism is also perceived as morally legitimate, but also you reduce forms of like bullying and stuff when people publicly come out as being affiliated with a particular kind of movement. This is good because it means that people who are already engaged in these kinds of movements are further willing to embed themselves in activism when there's less social ostracization from that. But you also just decrease stigma surrounding the term feminism overall, meaning that there's going to be a higher general level of social receptiveness to this kind of messaging. The second thing to say is that this has coincided with the narrative that ordinary people have the capacity and the obligation to engage in forms of activism. So that is, it is said that by sharing a post on social media, every single person is able to do something. And the narrative that every single person is able to do something has also allowed the left to use the rhetoric that you have an obligation to participate in activism. But you cannot say that everyone is complicit and you have the obligation to do something if there's a widespread narrative that the bars to activism are so high. So this then has allowed the left to push substantially more people to engage in this kind of activism. Finally, this has kept issues in public discourse for a longer period of time. So those who are performative need to justify the fact that they actually care about these issues. I think that they often keep sharing stories, which is how we spoke about BLM for so long, even after the murder of George Floyd. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in opening opposition.
I would like to thank the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and call on the Deputy Prime Minister to continue with his vocal